Antagonists are everywhere in mainstream media, and for good reason too. They're a near staple of modern storytelling and make up some of the most memorable and best written characters of all time. But what does it mean for an antagonist to be well written? We all know a well written antagonist when we see one, but identifying exactly why they're good is an area that I feel a lot of people might misunderstand. In this video, I'm going to try to completely change your understanding of antagonists by introducing a framework that categorizes every antagonist ever. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll have an even stronger grasp on why your favorite antagonist rocks and why others might fall short. When making a well-written antagonist, what's the single most important thing to consider about them? What comes first? To figure this out, I want you to think of your number one favorite antagonist ever. No matter who you're thinking of, I think there's a trait that they share with all the other favorite antagonists that people are thinking right now. I'm curious if you can guess what that trait is. Maybe some of you are saying every good antagonist has a backstory. Understanding what shaped them to be who they are makes them much more real, much more believable, and much more enjoyable to watch. After all, some of the most beloved antagonists are the most sympathetic ones. But everyone who picked the Joker for their favorite antagonist is laughing right now. One of the most consistent things about him is his inconsistent backstory. No one in the audience sympathizes with him, but everyone loves him. So, while being sympathetic is a fantastic trait to include, I don't think it's essential when making a well-written antagonist. I also bet a lot of you are thinking every good antagonist has a virtuous goal. An antagonist with a meaningful goal can almost be easy to root for. Even if their methods are considered wrong, if they're doing it for the right reason, they become a much more nuanced and thought-provoking character. But what do you tell everyone who's thinking of Hans Landa right now? They would tell you that he doesn't align with this sentiment at all. Everyone can agree that he does bad things for bad reasons. His goal is in no way something the audience can root for, and yet he's still considered a brilliantly written antagonist who makes the movie worth watching. So, while a meaningful goal is captivating, it too is not make or break for creating a well-written antagonist. Lastly, I bet a lot of you critical thinkers are saying, "Squamp Populace, this is too easy, man. Every well-written antagonist has beliefs that they cling to. When an antagonist strongly clings to their beliefs, it guarantees that they add a deeper meaning to a story." But for anyone who is thinking of a horror movie antagonist as their favorite, they might be shaking their head right now. What does Leatherface or Michael Myers believe in? They just kill to kill, yet they're clearly effective antagonists that are the stars of their stories. So, while beliefs are found in the vast majority of well-written antagonists, not even they are essential. This is why I say strong antagonists are a misunderstood concept. They don't have to be right. They don't have to win, they don't have to be sympathetic, they don't have to be reasonable, they don't need to be charismatic, they don't need to be evil, and they don't even need to believe in anything. But there is one thing that is truly non-negotiable. One aspect that's unanimously shared by every antagonist on your minds. In my opinion, the most important thing to consider when making an antagonist is the protagonist. More specifically, how the protagonist should be challenged. What every well-written antagonist has in common is that they exist to challenge the protagonist. Not just compete with them, but truly challenge them. If that's what you thought from the start, you are a level 1000 Squamp Watcher. Congratulations. By definition, an antagonist is someone who opposes the protagonist. And while we're going by the book, the protagonist just means the central character. However, I don't think these definitions help anyone. They're nothing more than labels. Anyone with a screenwriting book can regurgitate labels. Instead, I want to refine the definition of protagonist into something I believe is much more actionable and much more useful. On my channel, I believe that every story should have a key driving purpose. This can come in the form of a message, a moral, or even just vibes. The problem, however, is that simply preaching a purpose is not a particularly effective way to get it across to the audience. This can make a story hollow, forgettable, and just plain bad. An infinitely more effective way to get the point across is to prove it. A purpose can be abstract, but mapping it onto a character makes it much more concrete. That's where the protagonist comes in. I'm choosing to define a protagonist as the character which serves as a vehicle for a story's primary purpose. In layman's terms, they are the person who gets the point across. But remember, we don't want them to just preach it. We need them to prove it. And how do we prove something? We test it. We challenge it. We oppose it and see if it holds up. And how do we oppose a protagonist? Exactly, the antagonist. We've come full circle. See what I mean? The best protagonists don't just appear, they are made. Which is why the role of any antagonist is to challenge the protagonist, refine the protagonist, and ultimately change the protagonist. With that being said, it's time to introduce the framework. So an antagonist needs to challenge the protagonist. What exactly does this entail? I thought long and hard about all the different ways that an antagonist could do this, and then tried to boil each of those ideas down to their cores. That left me with 3 different types of challenges an antagonist can present. To explain the ideas, I made this framework that I'm calling the antagonist drill because it looks like a drill and helps us dig deeper into the protagonist's character. These 3 layers each represent a different way an antagonist can challenge a protagonist. I think for the most part, to get to a deeper layer, an antagonist must have also existed on the prior layers before it. Don't worry, if that doesn't make sense yet, you'll know what I mean when we get there. For one final disclaimer though, the level at which a protagonist lies does not determine how well written they are. There can be poorly written antagonists in the deepest layer, perfectly written antagonists in the top layer, and everything in between. As we go, I'll explain what exactly makes an antagonist well written at each level. The topmost layer on the antagonist drill are the obstacles. These antagonists ask, "Can you do it?" and force the protagonist to prove that they can. This can come in the form of a physical feat, a mental trial, a strategic puzzle, a test of stamina, or any other type of challenge that requires a certain level of ability to overcome. If we want to have a highly capable protagonist, we make them prove their abilities by challenging them with an obstacle antagonist. Remember though, we don't just want them to compete, we want them to truly be challenged. This will force them to grow. Obstacles are one of the best ways to catalyze a protagonist's growth in whichever ability the writers want to emphasize. A poorly written obstacle would ask the protagonist to do something that we've already seen them prove they're capable of. This wouldn't refine the protagonist's abilities and would just be redundant. Redundancy is bad writing. Nobody likes redundancy. It's bad writing. Instead of making the protagonist jump the same hurdle over and over, a good obstacle antagonist would raise the hurdles higher and higher, pushing the protagonist to their limits. As an example of this, I'll showcase Elle Lolliot from the series Death Note. If you watch the show, I think you can agree that Elle is a major reason Death Note is so good. Centered around the protagonist Light Yagami, Death Note is a show about how Light strategically pursues his goal of cleansing the world of criminals using his all-powerful notebook. But if all it took was writing a name in a book to achieve his desires, the show would be extremely boring and entirely pointless. That's where Elle comes in. Elle is a universally beloved antagonist because he's well written. And he's well written because he challenges Light's abilities, forcing him to overcome harder and harder obstacles. What makes Death Note so special is the brilliant ways that the two of them compete. Elle wants to expose Light as the killer he is, and Light of course wants to remain hidden while he carries out his goal. The entire relationship is comparable to an intricate chess match. In many instances, Elle actually outsmarts Light. This forces Light to refine his strategic abilities and work even harder to reach his goals. And when he works harder, it creates incredibly satisfying moments. He puts on a show of tactics that constantly leave the audience in awe of his intelligence. Tactics that were only necessary because of the obstacle that Elle presented. At the top of the antagonist drill, an obstacle may seem like a pretty shallow window into a protagonist's character. But the best obstacles do something that gives their story a much deeper meaning. In my opinion, the best written obstacles will not only showcase how capable a protagonist is, but also why they're capable. They make the protagonist dig deep into themselves to learn what it is that makes themselves strong. This is why I say a protagonist is a vehicle for a story's purpose. Whatever makes them capable of overcoming the obstacle is usually the very message the story is trying to communicate. For an example of this, I think I found one of my favorite antagonists of all time who shows just how powerful a well-written obstacle can be. The man I'm talking about is Terrence Fletcher from Whiplash. If you want a character that forces a protagonist to be the best version of themselves, then Terrence Fletcher is the quintessential example of this. His goal is to hopefully someday mold one of his students into an all-time great musician. To achieve this goal, he lives with the belief that encouragement is harmful and stunts an artist's growth. As a result, he's abusive, violent, ruthless, and basically evil. And if you've watched this movie, you probably agree that he steals the show. Every scene with him is like walking in a minefield. The terror everyone feels around him is palpable. But it's not just the fear he evokes that makes him so special. Throughout the movie, Fletcher constantly sets his students up for failure, especially the protagonist Andrew Neiman. He sees something in Neiman, so he's going to rip it out or defeat him trying. Anytime Neiman tries to prove himself, Fletcher raises the bar, forcing Neiman to practice harder. But the message of Whiplash isn't that practice makes perfect. There's no amount of practice in the world that would satisfy Terrence Fletcher. What finally satisfies Fletcher is Neiman's performance in the final scene. After Fletcher completely sabotages him, Neiman has every reason to accept defeat. However, with nothing to lose, Neiman takes matters into his own hands. He ignores the band members, he ignores the audience, and he ignores Fletcher. Instead, he believes in himself, which finally makes him ready to prove his abilities. He delivers a masterful performance, pushing the song beyond its sheet. The best part about the performance is when Fletcher finally turns and fixes Neiman's cymbal. For the first time in the entire movie, Fletcher directly set up Andrew for his success, because it was clear to him that he could not be discouraged. This ending had me clapping for Neiman like I was in the audience. It's a brilliant way to showcase not just how capable Neiman's drumming abilities were, but what made them so refined. Was Fletcher a psychopath? Yeah, I definitely think so, but he challenged Neiman's skills, his determination, and his self-confidence in a way that ultimately made Neiman great. While that specific relationship may be rare, I think any good obstacle will still achieve the same effect of pushing the protagonist's abilities to their limits. The second layer on the antagonist drill is where we find the dilemmas. Dilemma antagonists ask, what do you value most, and force the protagonist to choose. If we want a protagonist with iron strong conviction, we force them to prove their values by presenting them with a dilemma antagonist. A general rule of thumb is that the less balanced the dilemma is, then the less the protagonist is challenged, and therefore the worse the antagonist is written. Which means the more even the two choices are, the better the antagonist is written. What immediately comes to mind is the classic trolley problem. There's no explicitly correct answer, which is why it's such an effective tool at bringing out a protagonist's deepest values. For example, I'll present you a dilemma right now. You can either like this video and subscribe to Squam Populous, or you can just not. If you do subscribe, your feed will be blessed with videos just like this every week for free. If you don't, you might miss out on your future favorite video ever. Since subscribing is obviously the better answer, since there's no downside, then this dilemma isn't really effective. We already know you value good content, so of course you're going to subscribe. That's why a well-written dilemma antagonist will make the two choices as even as possible. Anyway, since you clicked on a video about antagonists, I'd guess that you already saw this next guy coming a mile away, so let's just get on with it. The Joker from The Dark Knight is the quintessential dilemma antagonist. All movie long, the Joker gives Batman the choice to either save lives or preserve his identity. With each day that Batman remains anonymous, the Joker kills more people. But to be more than just a hero and instead be a symbol that transcends an identity, Batman has to remain unknown. So he chooses to conceal his identity. And because of this, people die. Batman obviously isn't happy about paying the price with other people's lives, but the choice reveals that he values justice more. He values Gotham. But to test just how much he values this, the Joker forces him to pay even more. In a classic trolley problem, the Joker gives Batman the option between Harvey Dent and Rachel Dawes. Harvey Dent represents justice. With Harvey Dent alive, Gotham would have a symbol of justice that Batman himself could never achieve. Rachel, however, is the love of Bruce's life. So what does he value more? Justice or love? The Joker's dilemma forces Batman to choose, and we learn that it's ultimately love that Batman values most, which tragically ends up backfiring when we learn that the Joker switched the locations. It's hard to admit, but Batman's choice here makes him seem a bit selfish. I'm not saying he was right or wrong, but in this moment, he valued his personal life over the greater good. This revelation about Bruce's character is incredibly powerful, and was only possible because of the value-based challenge the Joker posed to him. Later in the movie, however, Batman chooses the greater good over himself. He takes the blame for Harvey Dent's crimes, choosing justice over his Batman's image. This choice solidified Harvey as the White Knight and Batman as the Dark Knight. This choice showed that, in the end, Batman values Gotham. A dilemma antagonist is the perfect way to really dig deep into a protagonist and find just what they value and how much. On the third and final layer of the antagonist drill, we find the mirrors. Mirror antagonists ask, can you accept your flaws, and force the protagonist to stare at a reflection of themselves. If we want the protagonist to be the most compelling version of themselves, sometimes they have to be flawed. Not just in the form of their incapabilities or their losses. Sometimes it has to come from the deepest part of themselves, their motivations. If you continually ask someone the question why, they will eventually reach a point where they don't have an answer. They just have their own truth. What a good mirror antagonist does is recognize the protagonist's truth and force them to confront it. For the first example, I'll use John Doe from the movie Seven. John Doe is one of the most sadistic, horrifying antagonists that comes to mind. He's a serial killer driven by the purpose to expose the truth that everybody is a sinner. Chasing him down are detectives William Somerset and David Mills, our two protagonists. For the record, if I had to pick one, I'd say it's Somerset, but who we're primarily going to talk about is Mills. With each murder, Doe isolates one of the 7 deadly sins, picking victims that exemplify a specific sin. Mills and Somerset are good detectives, though, and nearly catch him, but ultimately aren't quite able. It's Doe who finally turns himself in. In the final scene, in the middle of nowhere, Doe presents the dilemma. It's revealed that he murdered Mills' wife. Will Mills choose justice and arrest Doe, or will he choose vengeance and murder Doe? All movie long, we've come to learn that Mills is a short-fused hothead, which is why this is hardly even a dilemma for him. After some hesitation, Mills unloads his entire clip into Doe, exhibiting the sin of wrath, and completing Doe's message. Doe put a metaphorical mirror right in front of Mills, pointing out his inherent wrath before Mills even completed the deed. Mills was always going to murder Doe, and Doe knew that. That's because Doe knew that the two of them shared something in common. They both enjoyed sinning. The reason this is so powerful is that it not only forces Mills to reflect on himself, but forces the audience to reflect on themselves too. The audience may relate to Mills, and when they see the connection between Mills and Doe, suddenly they see the connection between Doe and themselves. This is where I think Seven's message rings through. I don't think the point is that everyone is an evil sinner. Instead, Seven is a warning about the dangers of getting pleasure out of evil. Mills was made the example. Somerset already knew this, and that's why if I had to pick one protagonist, it'd be him, but I digress. The next example comes from the show Jujutsu Kaisen, an often visited series in my fight scene videos. The protagonist Yuji has several antagonists, but none of them are as important to him as the disaster cursed Mahito. After killing several of Yuji's closest friends, Mahito basically becomes Yuji's sworn nemesis. He despises him with his entire being, but Mahito forces Yuji to look in the mirror. He explains to Yuji that, deep down, there is no difference between the two of them. Mahito exists solely to kill humans. That is his motivation. There is no deeper why. Yuji kills curses unconditionally. That's his motivation. They're two sides of the same coin. At first, Yuji fails to see the connection. It's only after their final confrontation does Yuji understand. Yuji does defeat Mahito in combat, but he doesn't just challenge his abilities. He challenges Yuji's own understanding of himself. He challenges his why. Faced with the realization that they are in fact the same, Yuji embraces his role. He can't answer the why. He can only accept that he is what he is. And if you ask me, this characterizes Yuji in a way that no other antagonist possibly could have. That is the power of the mirror antagonist. Mahito forces Yuji to accept his place in the world. Another subset of mirror antagonists that force the protagonist to accept their place in the world are forces of nature. These antagonists are so powerful that their will is inevitable, and they exist to make the protagonist accept that. One example of this would be Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men. He's so unstoppable that there was never a chance for anybody to simply overcome him. Instead, he forced his message onto everyone he encountered. He put a mirror in front of them, letting them know that fate was out of their hands. All they could do is accept this, or die rejecting it. Another force of nature antagonist would be Death from Puss in Boots. Puss lived his entire life with a sense of immortality because, as a cat, he had 9 lives. However, Death forces him to accept that he's not just another antagonist that Puss could overcome with his abilities, and there was no choice to be made that could save Puss's life. Death put a mirror in front of him, showing Puss that he was, in fact, mortal. All he could do was come to terms with his own inevitable mortality, so he did. This ultimately changed him into a character that appreciated life more and accepted love into his world, and made for an incredibly compelling protagonist and story. While mirror antagonists are fairly rare in media, I think they're incredibly effective at creating nuanced protagonists that carry important messages. Now it's time to be a little meta. The purpose of this video is to highlight a new way to think about antagonists. Since I'm the person carrying this message, that would make me the protagonist of this video. And if we've learned anything, all good protagonists need to prove themselves, which is where you all come in. I want you all to serve as antagonists in the comment section, challenging this theory in any way you can think of. Find any holes in this argument, any exceptions to the rules, or any other ideas I might have missed. This way, together we can refine the framework to become the strongest and truest version possible. If you think it's already solid, then you'll definitely want to subscribe to catch the upcoming content about it. So, the video is pretty much over now. Wait, not yet. Okay, now. Yeah, the video's over now. Bye.